In this video, we'll be exploring the outbreak of the Korean War as a means to demonstrate how the Cold War was a truly global phenomenon. While membership in the two main alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, was limited to European countries, many points of Cold War tensions and conflict occurred well outside of these zones. In fact, the first instance of military intervention by the United States and the Soviet Union occurred in Korea in 1950. So how and why did Korea become the centerpiece of global Cold War tensions? There were three main factors in play: Korea's long-standing regional significance, post-war decisions about the occupation of defeated countries, and U.S. and Soviet suspicions of each other. Let's take a look at each of these factors in turn. First, let's consider Korea's long-standing regional significance. Since the late 1800s, Korea had been at the center of tensions between China, Russia, and Japan. The majority of Korea's northern frontier borders China, but since the 1860s, there has also been an 11-mile border with Russia. Korea was also a target of Japanese interest during the late 19th century. Japan viewed control over Korea as the first step towards building an empire in mainland Asia. Japan gained control of Korea as a result of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 and annexed the country as a colony in 1910. China viewed this sequence of events with concern, correctly predicting that Japan would soon use Korea as a stepping stone to encroach upon Chinese sovereignty. Korea remained under Japanese control during World War II, when Korean troops and civilians were forced to help Japan in its war effort. The long history of Japanese, Russian, and Chinese interest in Korea ensured that the three countries and their allies would be watching events in Korea carefully. The second factor that helped turn Korea into a flashpoint of Cold War tensions was the questionable decision-making of the Allied powers about the country's post-war future. In August 1945, as U.S. and Soviet forces anticipated Japan's defeat, the two powers agreed to divide control over the occupied zones of East Asia. Korea was to be divided into a Soviet zone of occupation in the north and a U.S. occupied zone in the south. In a late-night meeting on August 14, 1945, U.S. generals identified the 38th parallel or latitude line as the dividing point between U.S. and Soviet control. Soviet officials agreed, and the split occupation began. Like the occupation itself, the division was originally intended to be temporary. However, as U.S.-Soviet relations rapidly soured, the division became permanent. A communist government was soon installed in the north, which became known, ironically, as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Meanwhile, South Korea elected a democratic government and became known as the Republic of Korea. The Korean people were not consulted on this division of their country into two, and not all Koreans agreed with this decision. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union had made it impossible to keep Korea unified. The perspectives of the two countries also influenced how they interpreted and reacted to events in Korea in 1950 at the start of the Korean War. This was the third main factor in how the Korean War turned into a global conflict. U.S. opposition to Soviet power grew as the Soviet Union installed communist or communist-influenced governments throughout Eastern Europe. By 1947, when a civil war broke out in Greece, U.S. authorities were adamant that Soviet influence must not expand beyond Eastern Europe. In what became known as the Truman Doctrine, the U.S. pledged financial support to any countries that were threatened by communist expansion. The Truman Doctrine clearly stated the belief of U.S. authorities that the Soviets were determined to spread communism around the world. The Soviet Union levied similar accusations of expansionism at the United States, describing the United States as the main force in the imperialist camp and decrying the country's opposition to communism. U.S. and Soviet perspectives were put to the test in Korea on June 25, 1950, when North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. North Korean leader Kim Il-sung aimed to reunify the country under a communist government. In 1950, there were three main foreign stakeholders in Korea: the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. How did these three players react to the North Korean invasion? First, the United States interpreted the conflict as an affront against democracy and a dangerous expansion of communist power. A combination of U.S. naval and air forces and UN troops were sent to support the South Korean government. Next, ever wary of foreign interventions in Korea, China's communist government opposed U.S. actions and rapidly sent 9 divisions of volunteer troops to support the North Korean cause. Finally, the Soviet Union claimed that the U.S. and United Nations interventions were part of a premeditated plan to invade North Korea, and the Soviets sent air support to North Korean and Chinese troops. With foreign interventions in full swing in Korea in 1950, the Cold War had officially gone global.